Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is Season 2, Episode 12. Catch-up Episode number 5, DC Movies. That's DC superheroes if it wasn't clear. I already talked about the Marvel movies from the pandemic era in Episode 7 of this season. Now, it's time to look at the other side of the coin with DC. The past 2.5 years from the time I started this podcast have featured, well, officially 5 DC movies in theaters or streaming, but the 5 I watched are not quite the same as the official list. I don't follow the Suicide Squad / Birds of Prey line, so I didn't watch The Suicide Squad. On the other hand, I did watch something else that came out in 2021, the Snyder Cut of Justice League. Yes, I watched that wild 4-hour epic from start to finish, and in fact, I did it without seeing the original Whedon cut, so that may be a different perspective. Unlike Marvel, which has pretty well sewn up all of its properties in the multiverse, if not the MCU proper, all but one pair of the DC movies I watched appear in separate universes. In their Marvel knockoff, the DCEU, yes I said it, they had Wonder Woman 1984 and more recently Black Adam. Then there's Zack Snyder's Justice League, which is not canon to the DCEU, but is said by Snyder to exist in an alternate universe. There was the animated League of Super Pets, which definitely takes inspiration from Justice League, but is also a clear parody of it. And finally, there was this year's new reboot, running parallel to the DCEU, Matt Reeves' The Batman. Although in that case, it happened because Ben Affleck left what was originally a DCEU project, causing it to be spun off separately. So let's see how they did. I'll start with the DCEU proper. Wonder Woman 1984 was one of the big name films to be released on streaming in 2020 as an alternative to theaters. This still failed to make up its budget, but that's not a statement on its quality. It was just due to circumstances. In fact, it was the most watched direct-to-streaming movie of 2020, so it had some good reviews. We last saw Wonder Woman, well, technically in Justice League, which debuted 5 months after her first solo film. But in that solo film, we last saw her in 1918, when she defeated Ares and Dr. Poison, but also lost the love of her life, Steve Trevor. The new movie, as the title suggests, picks up her story in 1984, in which Diana is living in Washington, D.C., working at the Smithsonian as a day job, but still moonlighting as a superhero and doing good around the city. She's also still putting a lot of effort into keeping her existence a secret, including destroying security cameras during her heroing. It's an odd choice in context, but kind of forced by the larger narrative where Batman struggled to trace her movements in Batman vs. Superman. Anyway, in 1984, a magical artifact turns up. A stone that can grant any person one wish. But like most wish-granting artifacts, the wishes come with a cost. Diana unknowingly wishes for Steve to come back to her, and he does. In someone else's body. Another odd choice on the part of the writers. What happens when that guy finds himself somewhere he doesn't remember going, covered in bruises and missing several days of work, plus someone with his description was reported beating up Secret Service agents? At least they showed he's okay in the epilogue. Anyway, Diana suffers the cost of losing her powers for her wish. And this is not good because Maxwell Lord, a corrupt businessman, gets his hands on the stone and figures out an unlimited wishes hack that actually works. Wishing to be the stone and grant the wishes himself. And take the price for himself too. From there, things rapidly spiral up to active nuclear war, and to stop it, Diana has to race against time to undo all the wishes, including her own. Overall, I thought it was pretty good. Not as good as the first Wonder Woman, but still a pretty good story. A nice character-building experience for Diana, and a worthy addition to the DCEU. That said, I thought there were some weak points in the film. And I suppose I've already noted a couple of them, but there were 2 others that I actually thought were bigger. First, you have the opening scene, where the young Diana loses an athletic competition, which honestly she could have won on points in any sporting event held today, and is taught a lesson about living by truth. The thing is, it felt forced to me. It felt like an awkward way to deliver the message, and the applicability of it to the ending, where she convinced everyone that it was better to give up their wishes rather than pay the cost, also felt kind of weak. The other weakness was in the climactic scene itself. That she convinced everyone, every single person, to renounce their wishes when she couldn't even convince Barbara face to face strains credulity, and I had to assume it could only work through the power of the magic lasso. Actually, on second thought, I'm not certain it was everybody. It could have just been the specific people involved when Max kept saying, "Granted, granted, granted." Still, it worked pretty well on the whole, and I was pleased that it went a different direction from the predictable use a wish to destroy the stone ending I was expecting. Next, the newest DC movie, just last month, was Black Adam. I don't have as much to say about this one simply because I already reviewed it on my blog quite recently, so you can check it out there. Black Adam, or Teth Adam, was originally the archenemy of Shazam in the comics, being given the same powers as Shazam by the Council of Wizards, but using them for evil. However, in recent years, he's been reimagined as an anti-hero. Even so, given the loose connection with the rest of the series, I can only assume that this is leading up to an eventual epic face-off between Black Adam and Shazam. Especially since Adam is presumably supposed to sit on the vacant 7th throne in Shazam's lair. This movie certainly leans into the anti-hero angle, with Teth Adam starting as a ruthless killer with a cause, but gradually softening and coming around to our way of doing things. But I feel that it could have been stronger on that point. You see, Black Adam is an ancient superhero from the nation of Kahndaq, a fictionalized version of Egypt, who has been entombed by the Council of Wizards since the Bronze Age. He doesn't understand our 21st century ways. In the Bronze Age, slaughtering the enemy army with overwhelming force, which he does when he first wakes up without even knowing who they are or why they're there, was just doing business. Or at least it was much more so than today. I don't want to get into that debate. Bottom line, I think they could have leaned into and explored that more instead of just telling him off for dropping people off buildings. Yes, Teth Adam is also angry and driven by vengeance, but the values dissonance should have been more than just a footnote. Anyway, despite the peripheral plotline, I think this story did a good job of advancing the overarching story of the DCEU as a whole, to the extent that there is one at this point, given that it brings in Amanda Waller from the Suicide Squad films, thus rounding out her role in the series. Waller, of course, is the longtime antagonist of the Justice League who wants to keep supers under the thumb of the government. In that respect, I think Black Adam was far superior to Eternals, probably the biggest MCU movie that fell outside the scope of the main storyline. If they do want to build a larger story, I suspect Waller would be a big part of it, especially if the previous Darkseid storyline fizzles out, as appears to be the case. Speaking of, 2021 gave us Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League. This was a reimagining of the 2017 Justice League, which was panned by critics. Snyder had directed the original version, but stepped down during post-production following the death of his daughter. Joss Whedon was then hired to finish the theatrical cut. However, Snyder was dissatisfied with Whedon's version, much like the fans, so he came back to fix it. The result was a 4-hour epic, literally twice as long as the theatrical cut, with quite a lot of new filmography, new characters, a completely new design for Steppenwolf, and much more. And yes, it is filmed in 4x3 pillar box. Do not attempt to adjust your stream. That decision was based on Snyder's fascination with the giant IMAX format, even though it never played there. Justice League follows the death of Superman in Batman vs. Superman, when Steppenwolf, the minion of Darkseid, shows up to take over the Earth, and Batman and company have to resurrect Superman to stop him. Darkseid is essentially the DC version of Thanos as the cosmic final boss of the franchise. And in fact, Darkseid came first, with Marvel creating the character of Thanos as an answer to him 2 years later. However, Darkseid is a more pedestrian villain than Thanos. He doesn't want to kill half the universe out of some imagined moral crusade. He wants to rule them. Specifically, he wants to find the anti-life equation, which, despite the name, will actually allow him to mind control everyone in the universe. Somehow. I guess the writers thought the anti-free will equation was too clumsy. And when I say Darkseid is pedestrian, this isn't just me now saying it. I was never that impressed with Darkseid all the way back when the animated Justice League series was airing when I was a teenager. I always thought Brainiac was a much better villain. However, Zack Snyder pulled it off. His version of Darkseid felt like a real Thanos-level threat. So how was the movie? Again, I think the best word to describe it is epic. By which I mean pretty good, not fantastic, but impressive for its sheer scale. It's well written on a technical level, I'll give it that. What I question more is its position in the series. If the DCEU were to continue from the Snyder Cut, which admittedly didn't happen, then this movie seems to be trying to be the DC equivalent of Avengers 1, assembling the team for the first time and facing off against the minion of the big bad. But it didn't feel that way to me. Darkseid's plan is already pretty far into motion. He's already gearing up for an invasion of Earth. It felt to me like it was at least as far into the story arc as Age of Ultron, maybe even the run-up to Infinity War. It felt like DC was trying too hard to catch up with Marvel and not putting in the work it needs to match it in franchise power. So that was one issue. The other issue I had with the Snyder Cut, and I don't know if it was like this in the original, is that it was so serious. DC was traditionally the lighter and goofier superhero franchise compared with Marvel, which delved into more down-to-earth, real-world issues. In some ways, this hasn't done it many favors because it's stuck with legacy material from earlier eras. I mean, seriously, the anti-life equation, the mother boxes, boom tubes, that's how Steppenwolf gets around. What do those words even mean? But the cinematic universes are completely the opposite. In the MCU, there's humor even in things as dark as Endgame and Multiverse of Madness. But the DCEU, for a lot of its films, and especially with Snyder's Justice League, is taking itself completely seriously. They can do comedies. Shazam and Black Adam are both comedies worthy of Marvel, but there barely even were any laugh lines in Justice League. Look at it this way. If this had been a Marvel movie, there would have been jokes about how Aquaman's trident has 5 points instead of 3, and about how Superman switching to an all-black costume looks kind of sinister. There would have been an extended bit about Steppenwolf's name, I'm sure, and they would have lampshaded the fact that his head is actually shaped like that. I mean, the jokes write themselves, but Snyder was having none of it. He had a definite theme going, and he put together a pretty good movie, but I'm not sure it's a winning formula in the long run. Slightly farther afield from the DCEU, there was one big animated movie in the franchise this summer, DC League of Super Pets. The protagonist of this film is Superman's superpowered dog, Krypto, who has to face off against Lex Luthor's literal guinea pig, Lulu, who gains powers from exposure to orange kryptonite. And also her hench kitten, Whiskers, because of course the cat is a sociopath. This movie, in some ways, runs parallel to Justice League. For one, I thought the inclusion of Cyborg in the League when he's usually with the Teen Titans was a clue. Plus, it's all about assembling the League's pets team. But it goes completely the opposite direction in style. And let me tell you, this movie is hilarious. Pretty much DC doing a complete parody of itself. Lulu telling Superman the glasses aren't fooling anyone, Ace whacking his head on Wonder Woman's invisible jet, The Flash saying, "High-fiving so slow and we're both really fast," which of course is a reference to how he was gratuitously portrayed in Justice League. Jokes about Aquaman's relative uselessness on dry land, Batman's over-the-top brooding. It's poking fun at everyone, and there's a lot more where that came from. And yet, this movie has real pathos, too. Like with Ace, who acts grumpy and doesn't get along with Krypto at first, but has a tragic backstory and really does want to help people. or PB with her quest to be worthy of being Wonder Woman's sidekick, or really any of the interactions between Krypto and Superman. This was a story that worked really well, and listing all the ways it did would take more time than I have here. This is one of those I think you need to see for yourself to fully appreciate it. Finally, we have the new reboot of The Batman. As I said, this was a reworking of a story that was meant to be a DCEU movie. And I was surprised by that because it feels like a completely different vibe from Ben Affleck's tricked-out, longtime veteran Batman. The upshot is that Matt Reeves' The Batman takes the gritty realism of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy and cranks it up to 11. This version feels real in ways that I didn't even realize were missing in the Dark Knight trilogy. Nolan's trilogy could probably have happened in the real world if you make some allowances here and there. More of a Dan Brown techno-thriller version of the real world. But the Batman is different. Just for starters, Batman's gadgets are relatively mundane, and he's only humanly competent with them. What I'm saying is that this is a story that could definitely happen in the real world, and that gives it an uncanny effect that I think really works for it. Let's look at the pieces. First, there's the Riddler, who is supposed to be one of the big names in Batman's rogues gallery, but here he doesn't feel like a comic book villain. And in fact, the writers made an effort to make him uncool and thus less appealing. He feels like a real-world terrorist/serial killer, with the Zodiac Killer MO and the Jeffrey Dahmer-esque look. He has a clearly homemade costume, he speaks like someone who is just plain unhinged rather than a clever mastermind, and even the way he kills Mitchell at the beginning looked conspicuously not choreographed in the usual sense, but felt like an angry man with no formal training just winging it. Ditto for Catwoman, who is still a super competent professional thief, but she's not wearing a custom mask and putting on a persona. It's just a slightly pointy balaclava. She's not playing a part, she's just getting the job done. Although, as competent as she is, you'd think she'd remember to close the curtains when she's putting on her costume. And then there's Batman himself. Robert Pattinson seemed like an odd choice to me as Batman, and I still thought that a good ways into the movie. But I gradually realized that the movie was going for a different kind of portrayal of Batman. Pattinson did a good job of coming across as a traumatized, dare I say emotionally stunted, young man, he's only been doing this for 2 years, who really does have more money than sense, and some hilariously bad coping mechanisms. This Batman looks out of place, standing around in costume with a bunch of police officers, in a way where I think only Watchmen comes close. Bottom line, this is the first adaptation where I've seen people call Batman a freak, and I thought they kind of had a point. Where I didn't suspend my disbelief so easily and actually thought, who does that? And rather than a mistake or bad writing, I feel like that was part of the story. Now, granted, I did not see Joker, so I don't know how that one compares. From the trailers, it feels like it could be a match in style, even though it's not the same continuity. But the Batman felt really new and different to me. And of course, in another dose of realism, Batman has to face the consequences of his actions, where his brand of vigilante justice, self-described vengeance, isn't really serving Gotham properly, and has in fact inspired the Riddler to act as a copycat of him. Even though Batman still comes out on top and on duty in the end, this is a deconstruction of the superhero genre on a level I never imagined before, and it worked great. So, those are the newest offerings from DC from 2020 onwards. And I'm reminded now that I originally wanted these catch-up episodes to be about the place of these movies in sci-fi as a whole, or else exploring what they say about the direction of the genre, not just a list of quick reviews. But that is not something I can do much with DC just because it's so mainstream. Superheroes are already a little bit peripheral to sci-fi, and at this point something like Justice League isn't really a sci-fi movie, it's a DC movie. Just like, if you've listened to recent episodes, Stephen King's books aren't sci-fi and aren't exactly even representative of horror, they're Stephen King books. The big franchises don't tell you all that much, in my opinion. When we get to more standalone stuff, I'll be able to say more. About DC itself, I'd say that it shows promise, but it's still where it has been for the past few years, struggling to find its feet. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is hosted by Libsyn and is available on all the major platforms. You can find me on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, on Twitter at Sci Meets Fiction, and my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. My movie recommendation for this episode, I'm going to go with DC League of Super Pets. DC has put up a batch of pretty good movies here, and The Batman was brilliant on an aesthetic level. But in terms of entertainment value, and not just that, but self-aware entertainment value, League of Super Pets is the only one that really knocked it out of the park. In the next episode, we have our first straight-up sci-fi author interview of Season 2. I interviewed Gary Benjer, former CFO of eBay and author of the sci-fi novel Unfettered Journey. Tune in for his perspective on sci-fi, technology, philosophy, and more. Thanks for listening.